your fear, and I showed you a path.
When I was growing up, there were a lot of grand-scale entertainments being done at the time by those great filmmakers. You know, obviously Lucas and Spielberg being the guys sort of leading the charge, and then into the early 80s. And so in my formative years, I was seeing a lot of very high-quality, large-scale blockbusters. When we were looking at the sort of cinematic landscape coming up to Batman Begins, it felt like a very long time since I'd seen the tone of movie that had defined the blockbuster for me as a kid. I sat in a room with Jeff Robinoff and Greg Silverman. You know, there were a lot of conversations about humor, how much humor is going to be in there. And I would say, well, you know, if you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, there's a couple of great gags in there, but it's not a comedic film. They got that.
Batman may have made the front page, but Bruce Wayne got pushed to page 8.
I convinced David Goyer to come on the project, even though he had very little time. But he had such a knowledge of the comics, and he so understood my ambitions for it, my interest in it. He completely got the tone of film that I was talking about. So he was very helpful in figuring out what we could or couldn't do within the terms of the canon.
When I first spoke to Chris about doing Batman Begins, Chris said, I want to do it in a very grounded manner. I definitely want to do an origin story, and I'm definitely interested in capturing or exploring what happened from the time his parents were killed to the time he actually became Batman.
The idea of recreating a character, of re-establishing an icon, we didn't really have a framework to look at for how you do that. And I remember very clearly saying to the studio, what do you need in this film? Like, what are you going to be upset about? What are you going to be missing?
I said to him, well, would it be cool, would it fit into your version if he had a car? Because I love the Batmobile.
And I remember very clearly sitting there and nodding and going, okay, I'll think about how to do that. But knowing that I couldn't conceive of any way at that stage to get the Batmobile into the film. I had been assuming we would not deal with that at all, that would be something that if somebody made sequels later on, because it seemed so fanciful. But once I'd heard that from the studio, they weren't imposing it, but it was clear that just emotionally, it wasn't going to be Batman for them without the Batmobile. They weren't saying they needed to sell a bunch of toys or anything. It was just kind of like, it's going to be disappointing without it. And I thought, okay, I'll take that on board. And it became a narrative challenge to sit there with David Goyer and figure out how do we make that credible in our telling.
There shouldn't be anything Batman really does because of style. It should always be function over form. And we felt that in some of the previous iterations, a Batmobile had been form over function. Once you say it's got to be realistic, how can you figure this out in the real world? It leads you to some problems, but it also leads you to some really interesting solutions.
He wanted this sort of urban assault vehicle, and he sort of, off the cuff, he thought, like a Humvee and an old 70s Lamborghini. So I went to Toys R Us and bought a Humvee, and I went over to the model store and bought, I think it was a Lamborghini Corniche, and I smashed them together to see what they'd look like. I just cut them up and stuck them together. And they looked awful. But that's how we got going.
And it became one of the most important elements of the film. And indeed, it was probably the first line I wrote on the film, really before David had even written his draft, was the, the "does it come in black" line. Because selling the Batmobile had sort of become symbolic to me of the entire process that we're going to have to go through in terms of making Batman a credible cinematic figure in this more realistic telling. The Batmobile, the costume, Gotham itself has to be completely rethought. You're having to update all these things. You're having to really try and view them through a contemporary lens.
Chris is coming out to my office in New York, sitting down to have conversations about, is it okay if we don't put the yellow circle around? Because I think that doesn't quite work. Chris was very concerned about how far he could go and always very sensitive on that issue. But we would keep looking.
Really, with Batman, it was all about the darkness visually. The ears, the cape. And it sounds obvious in retrospect, but what you learn very rapidly is without that cape, he isn't Batman. He's some kind of futuristic SWAT type guy. Without the ears and the cape, no matter how much else you retain, It's not Batman without those elements.
We live in the 21st century, and our Ulysses and our Achilles were Batman and Superman for many of us. You know, those were the sagas that we took to heart. And growing up with mythology like that, reading the comics of Batman, you hear your own Batman. Through that narrative, we process the world. It's like a religion. Each man has his own Jesus, you know? Your Jesus can be vengeful and righteous, and my Jesus can be forgiving and loving. And there's no right Jesus in the same way that there's no right Batman.
Anyone who took the job seriously and read all the comic books that we read and did all the thinking about it that you have to try to do justice to the story would recognize there's no definitive version of this character. You were just the latest custodian, so you just tried to do a version that did justice to who the character had been along the way. Chris gave me a copy of The Dark Knight Returns when I was a kid. I think it was for my 13th birthday, and it just blew me away. And I read Batman Year One, and I thought that was even better. So, approaching the movies as a Batman fan, I wouldn't just want to see a story I already knew. And so for me, I was constantly trying to weave notes or melodies that you're familiar with, but presented in kind of a wholly original, in a sort of sum of its parts way.
And I think what Chris has done is he's taken the best of Batman and then sort of the coolest bits of his aesthetic and joined them together. He didn't allow the sort of preconceived notions about what Batman could be to stop him from, you know, using Batman to explore like more serious parts of ourselves. That's the real leap that happened when Batman Begins came out. The first feeling you got was that this is definitely not made in a boardroom. This is like someone's point of view on this.
The boldness of Chris saying, I'm going to take these kind of incredibly out there constructs and I'm going to make you believe them. In fact, we're going to make that feel like that could happen tomorrow in New York City, because that's the world that we're living in now.
You know, he's interested in it being real. Not plausible, mind you. He can have the rooftop chase. Or the train fight. But he's interested in feeling real.
It's not necessarily about a direct reality, because I think the films are extremely heightened and they're extremely operatic. But it's about what I suppose you might term as cinematic reality. It's about giving the world of the films and the characters as much weight and validity as they would if your source material were not a comic book. If he was a character in another genre of film that you were having to introduce to the audience for the first time and get them to believe in. That's really what my use of the word reality is about. It's not about a literal reality. Part of the appeal of the world of Gotham is that it is not real life. It is removed from real life, and so you can address dramatic elements that would be extremely uncomfortable in a realistic film, in a way that lets the audience enjoy the experience and the entertainment, but hopefully gives them a little something to think about and gets under their skin in some ways.
Ha 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 ha.